Hey, I'm your host Ben, and welcome to the Lullaby Lounge. As we all get settled in, I would love to know where you're watching from in the world tonight. So please feel free to say hello in the comments. It's wonderful to know that no matter where you are, we can all gather here to relax and explore a little piece of history together. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and get comfortable. This is why it absolutely sucked to be a thief in Victorian London. For the vast majority of criminals in Victorian London, the most terrifying thing they could imagine wasn't the gallows. It wasn't the cat-o'-nine-tails, or the living death of a prison hulk. It was the workhouse. This simple, stark fact is the key to understanding the grim reality of the Victorian underworld. To comprehend the life of a thief, one must first comprehend the world that created them, a world where the official remedy for poverty was often more dreaded than the unofficial one of crime. The Victorian era was a time of staggering contradictions. It was an age of unprecedented progress, of industrial might and imperial grandeur, where wealth was accumulated on a scale never before seen. But beneath this glittering surface lay a London that was a world away from the high society balls of Mayfair. This was the London of the East End, of Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and St. Giles, a city of dire poverty, slums, workhouses, and huge divides between the working class, middle class, and upper class sections of society. These slums, known as rookeries, were labyrinths of human misery. The social investigator Arthur Morrison described the streets of the Old Nickel slum as black and noisome, the roads sticky with slime and lined with palsied houses, rotten from chimney to cellar. Imagine walking through these alleys. The air is thick with the smoke of coal fires and the stench of overflowing cesspits and open sewers that snake through the streets, carrying the waste of thousands. Water, when available, comes from a single communal pump, often contaminated and drawn from the same filthy streams into which sewage and refuse are thrown. The housing itself is a nightmare of decay and overcrowding. Entire families, sometimes with up to 9 people, were crammed into a single small, unventilated room. These tenements were built cheaply and quickly on marshy land, with paper-thin walls that offered no protection from the damp and cold, and were so structurally unsound that they could simply collapse, killing everyone inside. Vermin were a constant presence. Lice, fleas, and rats were as much a part of the household as the people themselves. This environment was a perfect breeding ground for disease. Tuberculosis, typhus, and cholera swept through the slums with terrifying regularity. For the children born into this world, life was exceptionally fragile. In the slums, it is estimated that 1 in 4 children died before their first birthday. For those who survived infancy, death remained a constant companion. It was rare for a child to reach adolescence without having lost a sibling or a parent. Life expectancy was brutally short, with many lucky to survive beyond their 30th birthday. This was a world where life was cheap, and the future was a luxury few could afford to consider. It was this crucible of despair, disease, and decay that forged the Victorian thief. The impossible choice: the workhouse versus the street. So, what was the official solution for the poor? It was an institution so feared, it drove people to choose the gallows over its supposed charity. This was the Victorian workhouse. The modern workhouse system was born from the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. Faced with rising costs for poor relief, the government sought a solution that would not only manage poverty, but actively discourage it. The middle and upper classes harbored a deep suspicion that they were simply paying the poor to be lazy. The architect of this new system, social reformer Edwin Chadwick, operated on a principle that would define the era's approach to poverty: less eligibility. This doctrine stipulated that conditions inside the workhouse had to be deliberately, systematically worse than the conditions of the poorest, most destitute independent laborer on the outside. The workhouse was not meant to be a safety net. It was meant to be a deterrent. It was a system designed to punish poverty itself, treating it not as a misfortune, but as a moral failing. The reality of the workhouse was a living nightmare, a place that earned the moniker prisons for the poor. Upon arrival, inmates were stripped of their identities. Their personal clothes were taken, replaced by a rough, uncomfortable uniform. They were subjected to a humiliating inspection and bath. Most cruelly, the family unit was systematically destroyed. Husbands were separated from wives, and children over the age of 7 were taken from their parents, housed in different parts of the building, and allowed only brief, supervised interviews with their loved ones. The diet was a study in calculated misery. It was designed to be monotonous and barely sufficient to sustain life, consisting largely of thin, watery porridge known as gruel, supplemented with bread and cheese. Meat was a once-a-week luxury. If that, the infamous scandal at the Andover workhouse, where starving inmates were discovered gnawing the rotting flesh from bones they were supposed to be crushing for fertilizer, was an extreme example, but it exposed the desperation inherent in the system. Life was governed by a strict regimen of long, hard labor, often for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. This work was frequently pointless, designed not for productivity, but to break the inmate's will. Men were put to the task of breaking stones with hammers or turning the crank, a heavy handle that did nothing but churn sand in a box. Women and children were often tasked with picking oakum, the painstaking and painful process of unraveling old tarred ship ropes, a job that left fingers raw and bleeding. The slightest infraction of the myriad rules, speaking when silence was ordered, not working hard enough, even crying, could result in harsh punishments, from solitary confinement to a reduction in their already meager food rations. The state's primary solution to poverty was not social support, but a system of deterrence and punishment. The workhouse was intentionally designed to be a place of last resort, a fate so grim that it was considered worse than almost any other. By making the legal option for survival a living hell, the system inadvertently made the illegal option crime a rational and in some ways more humane choice. The street, for all its dangers, offered a sliver of freedom, a chance at autonomy, and the possibility of a full meal, all of which the workhouse systematically denied. The Poor Law of 1834, therefore, did not just fail to solve the problem of poverty, it actively fueled the criminal underworld by supplying it with a steady stream of desperate individuals who felt they had nothing left to lose. The terror of the workhouse is the silent, ever-present character in the story of the Victorian thief. It is the ghost that haunted every back alley, and the reason why so many chose to take their chances with the law. The craft, a universe of petty theft. So you've chosen the streets over the workhouse. How do you actually survive day to day? The reality of a thief's life bore little resemblance to the grand heists of fiction. For most, it was a universe of petty theft, a constant grinding struggle for the next meal, or a bed for the night. The statistics paint a clear picture. The overwhelming majority of crime in Victorian London was not violent. Around 75% of all recorded offences were classified as petty theft. This was a world of opportunism, born directly from the grinding poverty and desperation that defined the lives of the working class. In the overcrowded, chaotic streets of the city, a moment's inattention from a passerby was a chance to survive another day. At the bottom of this criminal ecosystem were the pickpockets, often called fogle hunters, for their penchant for stealing silk handkerchiefs, or fogles. Many of these were children, a grim reality immortalized by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist, but based on thousands of real-life boys and girls. These young thieves were masters of their environment, thriving in the anonymity of crowds. Public gatherings were their hunting grounds, with markets, railway stations, and with dark irony, public executions providing the richest opportunities. Some hangings attracted crowds of over 200,000 people, a perfect sea of distraction for a small hand to slip into a pocket and emerge with a purse or a handkerchief. A step up in both skill and risk was the burglar, or cracksman. These were the specialists of the underworld, adept at gaining entry into homes and warehouses. They possessed a specialized kit of tools, the jemmy, a small crowbar for prying open windows and doors, betties, a set of lockpicks, and cutters for slicing through wooden panels. Most cracksmen worked alone, but some employed a lookout, a crow if male, or a canary if female, to watch for the police. The trial of Harris Lavey at the Old Bailey in 1870 provides a typical example. He was caught after breaking into a tailor's house in Whitechapel to steal a watch and chain, his presence given away by the rattling of the chain as he lifted it from a table. For those with more nerve and less finesse, there was street robbery. The most feared practitioners were the garroters. Working in teams, they would ambush a victim from behind, half strangling them into submission while an accomplice emptied their pockets. Though statistically rare, garroting caused widespread fear, which was fanned into a full-blown moral panic by the press, especially after a Member of Parliament, Hugh Pilkington, was garroted and robbed in 1862. Beyond these common trades lay a host of more unusual and desperate crimes. Skinners, for instance, were often women who would lure well-dressed children into an alley, strip them of their valuable clothes and boots, and leave them to find their way home in their undergarments. In an even more gruesome, though exceedingly rare example of the struggle for survival, one woman was convicted of murdering her mistress, boiling down the body, and selling the rendered fat as best dripping, a common cooking ingredient. The life of a Victorian thief was not one of glamorous heists and daring escapades. It was a constant, exhausting, nerve-wracking hustle. The daily reality was an endless search for a small score, a handkerchief, a loaf of bread, a few shillings, just enough to pay for a bed in a vermin-infested doss house or to buy a meal. The risk of capture, disease and violence was immense, and the reward was often pitifully small. It was not a career, it was survival, one stolen pocket watch at a time. The language, the secret slang of the underworld. In a city teeming with police patrols, private watchmen, and a network of informers, how did this vast criminal population communicate, plan their illicit activities, and warn each other of danger without being understood? They spoke their own language. This secret language, known as criminal argot or cant, was a vital tool for survival in the Victorian underworld. It was not a formal, structured language, but a living, evolving slang, a rich and chaotic mishmash of Cockney rhyming slang, Romany, Irish, and the jargon of street sellers known as costermongers. Its primary purpose was obfuscation, to allow criminals to speak freely in public spaces, even in the presence of a bobby or peeler, a police constable, without giving themselves away. This slang was a practical tool of the trade. It allowed thieves to identify one another in unfamiliar territory, to discuss potential targets, to fence stolen goods, and to sound the alarm about the presence of police or a blower, an informant. To the uninitiated ear, a conversation between two thieves might sound like nonsensical gibberish. To those in the know, it was a coded discussion of business. Yet this language did more than simply conceal criminal intent. It built a world. It fostered a powerful sense of community and a shared identity among those who lived outside the law. To speak the cant was to signal belonging. It was the verbal handshake of an exclusive club, a subculture forged in opposition to the respectable society that had cast them out. Criminals often referred to themselves collectively as the family, and their unique slang was the language of that family, a defiant marker of their separation from the mainstream world. It was a language born of necessity, but it became the cultural glue that held the fractured, dangerous world of the London thief together. The community, the myth and reality of the gang. The popular imagination, fueled by the sensational novels of the day and the enduring tales of Sherlock Holmes, often pictures the Victorian underworld as a vast unified criminal empire controlled by a single shadowy mastermind, a Napoleon of crime like Professor Moriarty. But was London's criminal landscape really so organized? The historical record suggests a far more chaotic reality. The Victorian criminal world was not a monolithic organization. The very idea of a distinct and organized criminal class that preyed systematically on respectable society was largely a construct, a myth perpetuated by social observers and writers like Charles Dickens, whose vivid portrayals in novels like Oliver Twist gave a powerful, but not entirely accurate shape to the public's fears. The truth is that most criminals operated alone, or in small opportunistic partnerships of 2 or 3. However, this is not to say that gangs were not a real and terrifying feature of London life. They were, but they were typically local, territorial, and brutally violent, more concerned with defending their patch of turf than with building an empire. The streets of London were home to numerous such groups, with names that spoke of their origins and aggression: the Boar Commoners, the Millwallers, the Golden Lane Gang, and the Lambeth Lads. These gangs, composed mostly of young men, fought vicious turf wars with one another, using fists, knives, and their heavy brass-buckled belts, which could be sharpened and used as flails to inflict horrific injuries. Their world was one of constant simmering conflict, where loyalty was to one's immediate crew, and the threat from a rival gang was often more immediate than the threat from the police. Perhaps the most sophisticated, and certainly the most unique of London's gangs, was the 40 Elephants, an all-female syndicate that operated out of the Elephant and Castle district from at least the 1870s. Also known as the 40 Thieves, they were closely allied with the male Elephant and Castle mob, and many of the women were the partners or relatives of the male gang members. The 40 Elephants were ruled by a succession of powerful queens, the most famous of whom were Mary Carr in the late 19th century, and later the formidable Alice Diamond, known as Diamond Annie. Under their leadership, the gang became expert shoplifters or hoisters. They targeted the lavish new department stores of London's West End, operating with military precision. Dressed in the height of fashion to blend in with wealthy clientele, they used a variety of ingenious methods. They wore specially modified coats and skirts with hidden pockets and hooks to conceal their loot, and employed elaborate distractions, such as faking fainting spells, to divert the attention of shop staff. They were known for their glamorous appearance and extravagant lifestyles, funded entirely by their criminal enterprise, and they fiercely defended their territory, forcing smaller gangs to pay them tribute. The criminal underworld, then, was a fractured and volatile ecosystem of competing groups and solitary predators. Far from being a unified empire under a single leader, it was a constant violent struggle for territory, resources, and survival. The only law was strength, and the only loyalty was to your own. The capture, the bobbies on the beat. With so much crime, from the petty pilfering of children to the organized raids of the 40 Elephants, one might imagine the streets of Victorian London as a lawless free-for-all. But a new force was rising, an institution that would fundamentally change the life of every thief in the city. They wore blue coats and tall top hats, and soon they were everywhere. Before the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829, law enforcement in London was a haphazard and ineffective patchwork. The city relied on a system of part-time parish constables, often reluctant to enforce unpopular laws, and aged, poorly paid private watchmen who patrolled the streets at night. The 1829 Act, championed by Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel, created a centralized professional police force, the first of its kind. These new officers, nicknamed Bobbies or Peelers after their founder, were intended to bring order to the chaos. Their introduction was met not with relief, but with widespread hostility and suspicion. In a society with a long history of social unrest and a deep distrust of state intervention, the new police were seen as an instrument of government oppression, an infringement on the liberties of freeborn Englishmen, and a step towards a French-style military police state. Early officers were frequently beaten, and public animosity was so intense that when a constable, PC Robert Cully, was stabbed and killed during a riot, a jury returned a verdict of justifiable homicide, a stunning rebuke of the new force. The force was also plagued by internal problems. Discipline was poor, and many of the first recruits were quickly dismissed for drunkenness and incompetence. Of the 2,800 officers serving in May 1830, only 562 remained 4 years later. Slowly, however, the Metropolitan Police began to evolve into a more effective and respected institution. A system of regular, uniformed patrols created a constant police presence on the streets, acting as a visible deterrent. A network of police stations was established across the city, connected by the newly introduced telegraph system, which revolutionized communication and allowed for coordinated responses to crime. Most importantly, a dedicated detective branch, the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, was formed to specialize in solving crimes and gathering intelligence. The police began to systematically collect and disseminate information about criminals, transforming the Bow Street office into a central hub of a growing intelligence network. By the latter half of the century, the Met was having a measurable impact, despite public perception, often fueled by sensationalist press coverage of crimes like the Jack the Ripper murders. The police were actually succeeding in reducing the murder rate. The establishment of the Metropolitan Police did more than just increase the chances of a thief being caught. It fundamentally altered the nature of being a criminal. Before the Met, the law was a distant, inconsistent, and often bumbling threat. After the Met, the law became a constant, patrolling presence on your street corner. This professionalized the element of risk. The game was no longer about avoiding a sleepy watchman, but about outsmarting a coordinated, information-sharing organization. This pressure, in turn, forced the criminal underworld to adapt and become more professional itself, developing more sophisticated methods, stronger internal codes, and a more defined identity in opposition to the force that pursued them. The police didn't just fight crime, they reshaped the entire criminal landscape, raising the stakes for everyone involved. The trial, the terrible majesty of the law. Your luck has run out. A hand falls on your shoulder. You're caught. The frantic scramble for survival on the streets is over. But what follows is a swift, bewildering journey into the very heart of Victorian justice, the Central Criminal Court, better known as the Old Bailey. The Old Bailey was the grand stage upon which London's criminal justice drama was performed. It was a machine built for speed and volume, processing upwards of 2,000 cases annually. For the accused, the experience was one of powerlessness and confusion. Imagine standing in the dock. You are likely poor, almost certainly illiterate, and have no access to legal representation. The trial itself is a rapid-fire affair, dominated by the testimony of the prosecutor and witnesses for the Crown. The published proceedings of the court reveal that the case for the defense was often severely abridged or omitted entirely, especially in cases that resulted in acquittal. This editorial bias creates an overwhelming impression of culpability, making a guilty verdict seem like a foregone conclusion. What is most shocking to the modern observer is the staggering disproportionality of the sentences handed down, especially for petty theft. The Victorian justice system was not designed for nuance or to understand the root causes of crime like poverty. It was a blunt instrument of punishment, and it fell heaviest on the poor and the young. The court records are filled with heartbreaking examples of this brutal calculus. These sentences reveal a system less concerned with justice than with social control. For a starving child who stole a loaf of bread, or a desperate man who took a pair of boots, the law offered no mercy. A trial at the Old Bailey was not a search for truth, but a formal and often final step on the path to the prison, the transport ship, or the gallows. Charles Dickens, through the voice of Mr. Bumble, famously declared that the law is a farce. For the thousands of petty thieves who passed through the dock of the Old Bailey, it was an arse that kicked with brutal, life-altering force. The Punishment, Part 1. The Prison, Breaking the Soul. A guilty verdict was not the end. For the Victorian thief, it was the beginning of a new kind of hell, a punishment scientifically designed not just to confine the body, but to break the human spirit. Welcome to the Victorian prison. In the 1840s, a new philosophy of punishment took hold, giving rise to the separate system. This system was built on the principle of total isolation, which reformers believed would force prisoners into introspection and repentance. Inmates were confined to their cells for up to 23 hours a day, When they were let out for exercise in the yard or to attend chapel, they were forced to wear thick cloth masks, sometimes called beaks, that completely obscured their faces. They were forbidden from speaking or even looking at another prisoner. They sat in individual stalls in chapel and exercised in separate, walled-off yards, ensuring total sensory deprivation. The stated goal was moral reform, but the actual result for many was a complete mental breakdown. The crushing solitude and silence frequently drove prisoners to madness. By the 1860s, the belief in reform had soured, replaced by a grim conviction that many criminals were habitual offenders who could only be controlled through fear. This shift gave rise to the silent system, a regime whose purpose was explicitly and unapologetically punitive. Its ethos was perfectly captured by its chief proponent, Sir Edmund Duquesne, who promised that prisoners would receive hard labor, hard fare, and hard board. Under this system, inmates worked and ate together, but in absolute enforced silence. A single whispered word could result in severe punishment. The hard labor was the centerpiece of this system, and it was a masterpiece of pointless torture. The treadwheel was a massive cylindrical staircase that prisoners were forced to walk on for up to 10 hours a day. They would climb endlessly, ascending the equivalent of over 8,000 feet, while the wheel itself often served no purpose other than to exhaust and torment them. Even more insidious was the crank. This was a handle in the prisoner's cell, which they had to turn thousands upon thousands of times each day. The crank was attached to a paddle that simply churned sand inside a box. It produced nothing. A warder could tighten a screw to increase the resistance, making the task agonizingly difficult, and a prisoner's meager meals were contingent on completing their daily quota of turns. Other tasks included oakum picking, the repetitive and painful work of separating the tarred fibers of old navy ropes, which would leave a prisoner's hands cramped and bleeding. Hard fare meant a deliberately monotonous and unappetizing diet, with the exact same meal served on the same day each week to heighten the soul-crushing tedium. Hardboard was the replacement of hammocks with simple wooden planks for beds, ensuring even sleep offered little comfort. The Victorian prison was not a place of rehabilitation. It was a meticulously engineered machine for psychological destruction. The enforced silence, the pointless labor, the isolation, the meager sustenance, every element was calculated to crush a prisoner's will, to erase their individuality, and to inflict a punishment of the mind and soul that far exceeded the severity of their original crime. The Punishment Part 2, The Exile, and the End. For many convicted thieves, the horrors of the Victorian prison were just a prelude. The cell was merely a waiting room for an even more final punishment. For some, this meant a sentence of civic death, an exile from which they would never return. For others, it was death itself. For much of the 19th century, a common sentence for serious crimes, including many forms of theft, was transportation. This policy, which saw criminals shipped to penal colonies in Australia, was seen as a neat solution to Britain's overcrowded prisons and a way to rid the country of its criminal class. Over an 80-year period, more than 160,000 convicts were transported from Britain and Ireland to the other side of the world. It was, in effect, a life sentence of exile. The journey itself was a brutal ordeal. Convicts were crammed into the dark, filthy holds of transport ships, sometimes known as hulks. In the early days of transportation, conditions were so appalling, with rampant disease and malnutrition, that as many as 1 in 3 prisoners died during the grueling 8-month voyage. Those who survived arrived in a strange, hostile land, where they were forced into hard labor, working in chain gangs to build the roads, bridges, and buildings of the new colony. It was a complete and total severance from their home, their family, and everything they had ever known. A living death. The ultimate punishment, however, remained the gallows. In the early Victorian period, Britain's legal system was still governed by the remnants of the Bloody Code, a set of laws that prescribed the death penalty for over 200 offences, many of them related to property theft. Execution was not a quiet, clinical affair. It was a grotesque public spectacle. On hanging days, the condemned were paraded through the streets from Newgate Prison to the gallows at Tyburn, or later, just outside the prison itself. This grim procession was a major public event, a kind of morbid festival that drew enormous crowds, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands. Charles Dickens witnessed a public hanging in 1849 and was left astounded and appalled. He described the wickedness and levity of the immense crowd, which was filled with thieves, low prostitutes, ruffians, and vagabonds of every kind. They engaged in brutal jokes, tumultuous demonstrations of indecent delight, and when the condemned were finally turned quivering into the air, there was no more pity or emotion than if the name of Christ had never been known. The death of a human being was turned into a form of mass entertainment, a public holiday for the morbid. This practice of public execution was not abolished in Britain until 1868. The punishments meted out by the Victorian state were not simply a set of alternatives. They represented a terrifying, escalating scale of dehumanization. Each stage was designed to strip away another layer of a person's identity. The prison aimed to destroy your will and sanity. Transportation aimed to destroy your identity and your world, erasing you from your home country. And execution aimed to destroy your very life, turning your final moments into a gruesome public performance. It was a system whose ultimate goal was not correction, but the complete and total obliteration of the criminal as a human being. The life of a Victorian thief was not a romantic adventure of daring escapades and gentlemanly rogues. It was a desperate tightrope walk over a chasm of despair. On one side lay the slow, anonymous death of the slum and the workhouse, a world of grinding poverty, disease, and institutional cruelty, designed to crush you into dust. On the other side lay the swift, spectacular brutality of the law, a world of professionalized police, biased courts, and punishments designed to break your mind, erase your existence, or turn your death into a public holiday. The decision to steal was rarely a choice between right and wrong. For thousands, it was a calculated gamble, a rational response to an impossible situation. It was a choice between a fast death and a slow one, between a life of constant fear on the streets and a life of certain misery in the workhouse. There was no escape, only a choice of punishments. To be a thief in Victorian London was to be trapped in a game that was rigged from the start, where the only prize for winning was surviving, hungry and terrified, to play another day. The story of the Victorian thief, grim as it is more than just a historical curiosity. It is the origin story for many of the most pressing and persistent debates that shape our own society. The shadows of the 19th century slum, courthouse, and prison are long, and they touch us still. The undeniable link between economic desperation and crime, so starkly illustrated by the choice between the workhouse and the street, remains at the heart of modern discussions about social justice and criminal reform. The question of whether poverty is a cause of crime or an excuse for it was debated as fiercely in the 19th century as it is today. Furthermore, the Victorian era witnessed the birth of the media-driven moral panic. The press-fueled hysteria surrounding the garroting craze of the 1860s and the later sensationalism of the Jack the Ripper murders demonstrate how public perception can be manipulated to influence policy and stoke fear, often in ways that are disproportionate to the actual threat. This phenomenon is instantly recognizable in our own age of the 24-hour news cycle and social media outrage. Most profoundly, the Victorians created the very institutions that define our modern justice system. The establishment of a professional, centralized police force and the development of the modern prison system raised fundamental questions that we are still wrestling with today. Is the primary purpose of policing to prevent crime or to punish it? Are prisons for rehabilitation or for retribution? The debates over the separate system and the silent system are the direct ancestors of our current arguments over solitary confinement, prison labor, and the ultimate purpose of incarceration. The world of the Victorian thief is not a distant, alien landscape. It is the foundation upon which our own world of crime and punishment was built. The story of the Victorian thief is inseparable from the story of the city they inhabited. To truly understand the world they were trying to survive in, you need to walk the streets of the Victorian slum yourself.